The morning began with a fragile optimism that tasted like citrus. Grace Alvarez folded a quilt into the back of her slate blue hatchback, tucked beside a paper sack of warm empanadas. Lucas, 8, crashed down the stairs in mismatched socks. Emilia, 4, bounced like a small comet with plastic ponies clacking in her fist. The neighborhood smelled of last night's rain and wet cedar. Grace locked the door, tested it twice, slid the key into the zip pocket of her jacket as if she were stashing luck. She loaded bottled water, a mint green thermos, and a small first aid pouch. The air held a fine cold that promised a clear climb into the North Shore Mountains. Lucas slung a dinosaur backpack, testing the zipper as if checking a harness. Emilia announced a solemn plan to show Grandma how to braid Pony's mane. The sky was washed glass. Somewhere, a crow stitched a black line across it. Seatbelts clicked. Grace tightened Emilia's straps, tugged Lucas's shoulder harness until it hugged him snug. "Grandma's apple pie," she sang. "And Grandpa's telescope," they chorused, ritual turning distance into permission. The hatchback smelled of clean cloth and cinnamon. She set the route on the dash. Switchbacks beyond Lions Bay, a turnoff along a ridge road older than her driving lessons. The city unspooled behind them. Bridges glittered with thin sunlight. Freighters sat like patient beasts in Burrard Inlet. Traffic softened until the road became a ribbon. Pines gathered in ranks, shoulders wet with last night's mist. Grace loved this part. The little ceremony of leaving, the mountains rising like a promise they were allowed to keep. Clouds drifted in from the west, soft as wool but carrying weight. A roadside sign warned of steep grades and tight curves for the next 20 kilometers. She lowered the music, reset her grip. 10 and 2. The asphalt narrowed where the cliff had eaten the shoulder winter after winter. Guardrails held dense like old stories. Lucas named peaks from the folded map Grandpa had given him. Emilia made her ponies leap seat-stitch canyons with the consequence-free joy of 4 years old. Grace listened to the car, its healthy hum, the whisper of tires finding purchase. She watched the weather, measured light where rain streaks hardened into glass. A fine drizzle began, beating the windshield into a false galaxy. Wipers swept it into arcs. She tapped the brakes before a posted S-curve, felt the chassis settle, remembered her father's litany. Eyes up, hands steady, brake before the turn, not in it. She pictured his hands explaining what geometry meant when wheels tried to argue. The curve gathered the car into its palm. A white pickup appeared around the blind inside line, too fast, back-end wig-walking. Grace gave it room, instinctive mercy, and the hatchback's right tire kissed gravel. One loose, slick stone rode under the sidewall. The rear fishtailed. ABS chattered like teeth in cold. She corrected. Grit behaved like marbles. The guardrail drew near. Metal met metal with a hollow, frightened sound. The rail bowed, groaned, surrendered the way old bone does. The car nosed over emptiness. Brakes went to the floor and found air. The rear axle snagged on a bent rib of rail with a grinding scream. The world stopped at an angle that made the sky where the road should be. Emilia's buckle clicked open, tiny, treacherous. Gravity took her like a hand. She slid forward in slow, awful inches, ponytail lifting as if underwater. Grace twisted, arm threading between seats, fingers hooking the small jacket under Emilia's armpit. The car creaked, reconsidering. Lucas reached, held back by his strap, face gone pale as rain. "Hold," Grace whispered, both command and prayer. Her left knee jammed the console. Right foot searched useless air. The emergency brake seemed a rumor an inch too far. The phone on the floorboard lit with an unread text from her mother. "Pie in the oven. Drive safe." She didn't dare move. Even breath had weight now. Everything narrowed to the sound of ticking metal. The mountain breathed in mist. The canyon waited with indifferent patience. Grace breathed like labor, measured, rope-like, the only thing she could choose while the universe argued. Emilia went quiet, eyes fixed on her mother the way children do when they decide the world will obey her. Far behind, a truck engine downshifted. The white pickup was gone, fleeing its almost crime. A raven landed on the broken rail and tilted its head, surprised into silence. The hatchback's front wheels spun gently, freewheeling above an audience of rocks and scrub. Time stretched, thin, bright, dangerous. A shape came running along wet asphalt, boots biting, jacket dark with rain. He was there because he checked rattles and weather, because attention is a habit. He moved like someone who had practiced emergency in small ways for years. Grace didn't yet know his name. She knew only that help had waited and it was running toward her. Tell us which city you're watching from, and rate this story 0 to 10 at the end. Daniel Hart had pulled his old Land Cruiser into a turnout above the S-curve to listen to the roof rack in the clouds. He worked trail maintenance for the district and collected the gear of useful people. Webbing, a coil of rope, a pry bar, a first aid kit, bright chalks that had been a joke gift. He caught the glint of blue where blue should not be and sprinted. He reached the shredded guardrail and looked down into a quiet prepared by catastrophe. The hatchback hung nose down, the canyon reading it like a ledger line. A woman braced across seats, arm threaded backward to hold a child. A boy cinched tight, eyes like winter sky. Daniel said low and steady, "I'm here. I'm going to help. No one move unless I tell you." He called in the mile marker, the vehicle, the compromised rail. Help was on its way, but minutes on a precipice were teeth. He met the woman's eyes. A contract formed in 2 seconds. He would be the hands, she would be the hold. Her belt failed, she said, voice tight as wire. "I've got her." He nodded once like a promise. He wrapped the rope twice around the Land Cruiser's frame, ran it through intact posts of the rail, leaned his weight to test bite. Rain stitched his hair to his forehead. He slid down on his hip to the rear quarter panel, spreading his torso across metal the way you press a skittish horse. The car creaked, shifting a half-inch, found a new negative stillness. "Good," he murmured, "to steel, to physics." He fed a loop of webbing through the space between headrest and seatback. The rear door canted toward the canyon, wedged by bent frame. He planted a shoulder, shoved. It popped an inch. Cold air whipped in, tasting metallic and piney. "I'm going to make a seatbelt hug for her," he said. His fingers found the little girl's wrist, bird bone small, pulse fast but steady. He threaded the webbing beneath her, careful not to jostle Grace's straining hold. "On my count," he told the mother. "You let me take some of her weight." "Not all. We share it." He clipped the webbing to rope with a carabiner, tested twice, then a third time for superstition. 3, he said, and the rest of the numbers lived inside the action. Grace exhaled and seated inches. The car spoke in long vowels of stressed metal. The canyon listened. Amelia slid back, webbing snug under her arms, Daniel drawing her like a fisherman committing a miracle. He pivoted a knee into the seat, gathered the small body, anchored his own weight to the frame. Up top, a red scarf stranger and another motorist grabbed the rope, hands becoming a human pulley. The world practiced being kind. Amelia surfaced over the rail wrapped in a crackling silver blanket, sound escaping her like steam from a kettle. "Mama." The red scarf woman, competent and grave, whispered, "She's coming." Lucas was next. The belt had held, fear had petrified him. Daniel slid a hand over the boy's chest, eyes level. "You did exactly right. Now we move together." He cut the strap to control the release, threaded the webbing, eased the angle so gravity became an ally instead of a judge. Lucas rose, shaking, and the mountain exhaled an inch. Sirens braided the rain, closer, not here. Daniel's palms burned with wet rope. His breath measured the seconds. He saw the emergency brake half-cocked, the angle, the chalk-shaped solution. "Your turn," he told Grace. She shook her head a fraction. "If I shift, it shifts," she said. He believed her. He went lower. A bright yellow wedge slid under the right front tire, silly and beautiful. He tapped it into the skin of the earth with the pry bar's heel, listened for the small music of friction. "On 3 you pull the brake hard," he said. She tugged. 1 click. 2. A third that sounded like fate changing its mind. The car held, insulted but contained. "Now you." He threaded webbing across her shoulders. Right hand to the headrest. Left to the frame. Small moves. "I'm your counterweight." Rain slicked her hair over her eyes. He brushed it clear with a gloved knuckle. Her jacket snagged, he freed it. Inch by inch, she left the front and entered the back, the geometry of survival drawn in breaths. They paused when the world asked them to. He listened to the creak grammar of rails, to the dull thud of distant surf, to the argument between mass and mercy. Then they moved again. Her shoes slipped. His grip did not. The door gap felt impossibly narrow until it wasn't. Hands above turned into a cradle. Grace's knees gave on the safe side. Bodies made a shelter around her. She looked left and right until her children resolved from fear into flesh. The sound she made had their names inside it without needing syllables. The 3 of them locked into each other, a weatherproof architecture built of rib and breath. Firefighters appeared like a practiced answer. Yellow helmets, measured voices, a language of knots and clips. They took the rope line, added another, spoke to each other in numbers that sounded like reassurance. A paramedic knelt with Lucas, fingers to pulse, questions soft and precise. Another tucked a warmer blanket around Amelia, new heat billowing. Daniel stepped back, palms buzzing as adrenaline drained like a tide. He looked at the hatchback, a stubborn animal caught in a fence. The chock held. The brake held. But angles age quickly on wet rock. A captain peered at geometry and frowned the way professionals frown when luck is part of the build. "Let's inch it to secure," someone said, and the mountain did not answer. A tow hook clinked. Lines tightened. Rain eased into mist that made halos of truck lights. Grace sat on the asphalt, blanket clutched, eyes never leaving the car. She had the posture of someone waiting on a verdict even after the loved ones have walked free. A firefighter slid into the driver's seat to play the tiniest game of leverage. The chock protested in rubber syllables. The frame groaned like a door to a room no one should enter. "We have her," Daniel murmured to no one and everyone, meaning Grace and the children and maybe the stubborn part of himself still trying to hold 1,000 pounds with a plan. The chock popped. Some sounds are small and catastrophic. The car decided it had been borrowed from gravity for long enough. It shrugged, the elegant motion of an animal returning to its element, nose dipping, rear lifting, a pause of breathtaking theatrical cruelty, and then it went. The world watched in slow dread. The hatchback tipped beyond recovery, turned once, twice, caught a boulder like a drumbeat, shattered glass into a flock of glittering birds, and vanished behind a rib of rock. The final sound was thunder written in metal. The silence afterward was almost holy. Amelia flinched against her mother. Lucas handled the noise like a soldier does, straight back, eyes forward, hands shaking later. Grace closed her eyes and pressed their heads to her collarbones like she could stitch them there. Daniel set his palm on the rail and felt the vibration echo through steel into bone. Someone swore softly. Someone else called to confirm the perimeter. Radios skated from panic to protocol. The Raven lifted, offended by drama. The canyon resumed being a canyon, uninterested in the story people would tell about this morning. Grace looked at Daniel across a space filled now with afterlife. She didn't say thank you yet. The words were too thin in the moments when they mattered most. She nodded, a movement small as a heartbeat, and in it lived entire ceremonies. He nodded back. The contract between strangers folded and stayed in both pockets. Reports were written, distances estimated, angles recorded as if the page could keep what the cliff tried to take. Paramedics checked pupils, wrists, the small tremor in Grace's hands. The red scarf woman, a nurse named Rhea, they learned, held Amelia while a foil blanket turned her into a quiet, crackling bundle. Lucas answered questions like a pilot, calm, precise, brave through effort. Daniel fetched water. He found the paper sack in the recovered items and brought a slightly flattened empanada to Grace, apology in the tilt of his wrist as if returning a borrowed miracle. She laughed, cracked and real, broke it in half. Steam rose like a blessing. "You saved us," she said. He shook his head. "You saved them. I just added rope." The fire captain offered to escort them to safer ground. Weather lifted enough to show a sliver of pale sun. Cones and tape flagged the broken segment, a bright bandage on an old wound. The mountain shoulder steamed lightly, pine needles shining like lacquer. They loaded into Daniel's Land Cruiser because the paramedic didn't want Grace driving with her nerves still electrified. The kids were buckled into the back, wrapped in blankets that made them look like ceremonial astronauts. Grace took the passenger seat, hands worrying the edge of the quilt she'd folded that morning. The S-curve reappeared, now benign, as if innocence were a costume a road could put back on. Daniel's hands rested loose but ready on the wheel, the posture of a man who believes in physics and grace. They passed the cones. The canyon to the right stared back, patient as the sea. Up on the ridge, ravens argued the news to no one who needed it. Grace's fingers hovered a moment, then rested on the fabric of his shoulder. It wasn't an embrace. It was the kind of contact that says, "I am here, you are here, the day kept us." He breathed out like setting a heavy pack down. The heater sighed warm air. Wet boots smelled faintly of iron and rain. 10 kilometers later, a driveway shouldered into the forest and spilled them into a clearing where a cedar farmhouse watched the ridge. A woman in an apron ran out with fear already aging her face. A man followed, hat in both hands because hats know when to be held. The family unfolded around the survivors like a tent in sudden weather. Inside, the house smelled of cinnamon and starch and dry wood. Outside, clouds tore into sheepish scraps. Daniel stood on the porch a second longer than politeness requires, listening to his own pulse learn normal again. He kept the mountain in his eyes because leaving it too quickly makes the ground feel unserious. Grace packed foil onto a paper plate and returned it to him as if pressing a medal. "For the way back," she said. "And, if you ever need to check the clouds from a safe porch." He smiled with the gentle embarrassment of the practical. "Keep the belt snug," he told Lucas. "Make sure the ponies ride safe," he told Amelia. She lifted a solemn thumb like an oath. Afternoon blurred into a tender busyness. Borrowed socks, fresh sweaters, the kettle's kind whistle. Rhea the nurse had followed up with a phone call born of good habits, reminding Grace to notice dizziness, to drink water, to sleep even if sleep arrived like a stray animal. The house received these instructions and made them a nest. Grace sat at the kitchen table while her mother cut slices of pie too big for grief and just right for survival. Lucas talked with Grandpa about telescopes, voice steadying as it did the work of telling. Amelia arranged her ponies in a semicircle to hear her lecture on seatbelt safety, which consisted mostly of pats and stern nods. Down in the canyon, where people rarely look, the hatchback cooled into silence, steam and oil making a brief marriage with wet stone. Tow crews would come later, respectful, businesslike, slightly reverent the way people are around wreckage that spared lives. The mountain had already filed the morning into its archive of almosts. Grace stepped onto the back deck wrapped in her father's sweater, the knit holding the day's smell of rain and rope. The view laid the ridge out like a sleeping animal. She set her hands on the railing, closing the circuit between wood and pulse. When she closed her eyes she was back at the angle, arm threaded, breath counting itself brave. Daniel parked at a turnout halfway down the mountain and ate a cold empanada with the focus of a pilgrim breaking communion. He watched the taped-off rail, the new caution signs, the thin line of traffic behaving chastened. He let the quiet fill back in. He did not call anyone to say what he had done because some acts are their own report. He drove home into an evening that smelled like rust and eucalyptus from a neighbor's yard. He hung the rope to dry, checked the webbing for scars, set the chalk on the workbench and touched it like a relic from a saint he did and did not believe in. His hands trembled once, twice, then remembered tools and grew steady. He slept badly, the body replaying impact as if learning choreography. Waking was like surfacing from under ice into air. Morning would bring work, clearing a culvert, flagging a washout, the square kindness of routine. The mountain would be there, unimpressed and generous. In her old bedroom, Grace lay between her sleeping children and listened to their breaths. She texted Daniel a single line, the number saved from the paperwork exchange. "You checked the clouds, and it saved us." He saw it before dawn, smiled without becoming someone who needs to explain smiles, and replied, "You held on, and it saved them." People need stories to measure the size of days. The next morning, neighbors came with muffins and practical questions. The grandparents told the tale in a chorus. The S-curve, the slide, the rope, the chalk, the cars shrugging fall like a swan dive into fate. The children listened like witnesses and correctors. Lucas sketched the angle on scrap paper, ruler straight lines for rail and road, a purposeful dot for the chalk. He labeled forces like a junior engineer, then added a stick figure with a rope and wrote Daniel in neat block letters. Amelia drew the car as a blue whale rescued by friends. She added a raven as a judge who decided to be kind. Insurance called, voices bright with liability and distance. A tow company called, grave and efficient. A reporter called and was turned down because some mornings belonged to kitchens, not cameras. Grace wrote her own version in a notebook that smelled faintly of pencil shavings and old essays, sentences long enough to carry weight. Back at the ridge, Daniel walked with the survey crew, marking the eaten shoulder, tapping the rail with a knuckle the way doctors test knees. He suggested 2 more posts, a better gravel bed, a rougher aggregate to bite rain. He spoke gently because land takes correction better when asked than ordered. A week later, Grace drove up the replacement car. Another hatchback, the same color because not all superstitions are useful. She stopped at the turnout without deciding to, stepped to the repaired section, and laid her palm on cool new steel like greeting a scar. The canyon breathed up air that smelled like coins. Daniel was there because work continued. He nodded, gave space. She nodded back, eyes soft with the complicated gratitude that doesn't want to be a ceremony. They spoke in logistics. How are your folks? The kids sleep any better? Watch for black ice on the shaded side. The mountain stood by, approving of plain talk. Grace drove on to the farmhouse. She stood with her father at dusk as the ridge stitched itself to the first stars. You scared the hell out of me, he said with a softness that made the words a blanket, not a whip. Me too, she said, and smiled like someone who had negotiated with gravity and kept the receipt. That night, she told the full story to herself for the first time without shape-shifting into other endings. The car fell. The people didn't. The sentence fit without snagging. She slept like a person whose body finally believed the verbs. Weeks fold around events until they sit in the pocket like a smooth stone. Grace started checking belts with a ritual fervor. Lucas learned torque values from Grandpa and developed a suspicious love for knots. Amelia lectured strangers' plush toys about click and tighten with the confident pedagogy of 4-year-olds. Daniel's team installed new signage at 3 other notorious bends. He recorded a training video where he said almost nothing heroic and much about angles, chalks, and planning. He did not mention the Raven because some details belong to your private myth. On a rainy Thursday, Grace drove the ridge again, this time with her mother in the passenger seat. She realized how quiet her body felt, alert but not hunted. She touched the rail with her eyes, not her hand, and let the canyon be a canyon instead of a ghost. Her mother watched her drive the way mothers do, half proud, half 20 years ago. At school pickup, Lucas told his teacher that physics had saved them, which was true for a certain definition of saved. Amelia declared she wanted to be a firefighter and a pony doctor and a person who hands out shiny blankets. The teacher said the world would be honored. In a coffee shop below the ridge, Grace and Daniel crossed paths by accident and the opposite of accident. They exchanged updates like neighbors in a village that was really a long strip of road. He brought her a spare emergency hammer for the glove box. She handed him a fresh bag of empanadas in return, because rituals notice themselves and reproduce. They didn't trade big words. They didn't need to. The mountain's archive holds the morning in permanent ink. Any sentence spoken over it would sound like translation. They became the sort of acquaintances who nod to each other in hardware aisles and at trailheads, each carrying the other in the category labeled proved. On the anniversary that only the 4 of them marked, Grace drove to the turnout and watched fog curl up the slope like a slow tide. She spoke aloud to no one, "Thank you for the wide side." The canyon, which specializes in scale, accepted the offering and kept its own counsel. When the tow crew finally brought the hatchback up, months later, it looked like a sculpture about humility. Grace signed what had to be signed. She ran a flickering hand over the ruined dash, found, impossibly, the tiny zipper pocket where she had stashed the keys that morning. Inside lay a dime and a button. She laughed and then she cried and then she left. Daniel watched from the roadside, hard hat under his arm, seeing in the wreck something both foreign and close, the outline of an almost that didn't happen. He felt the same tired gratitude flood the joints. He went back to measuring culverts, because water and gravity require daily conversation. Grace's parents hosted a small dinner where no one said the words lucky or miracle out loud. They spoke instead of soup, of the weather that had finally learned patience, of the way the Raven pair had nested nearer this year. After dessert, Lucas set the telescope on the deck and taught Amelia to find Jupiter, confident and careful. In town, a traffic department memo changed budget lines for rural guardrails. A chain of decisions lengthened, signs ordered, aggregate mixed, schedules shuffled. The morning created tiny ripples of prevention in places none of them would ever see. This is how survival does its quiet work. On a sunlit Saturday, Grace took the kids to the beach where the inlet meets the sound. Waves made the world briefly simple. In, out, in, out. The children built a fort that could not resist water and did not need to. Grace watched, folded the old quilt over her knees, and let the returning tide rewrite the last stubborn pages of fear. Driving home at dusk, she took the lower road. Flat, forgiving, unheroic. She caught herself smiling at the ordinariness of traffic lights, at the way the car idled like a cat. She realized the story was not just about a cliff. It was about every small decision that nudged them toward morning. She tucked the children into bed with a new ritual, a hand on each chest, counting 4 breaths. A lullaby that had learned the shape of rough edges. A nightlight placed not for monsters but for memories that still believed the angle would return. The house exhaled with them. A decade is a long breath. Lucas turned 18 with grease under his fingernails and acceptance letters from engineering programs scattered on the table like maps. He still carried a folded paper with a chalk sketched and labeled. Emilia, 14, ran cross-country trails with ferocious joy and a first-aid kit in her race bag because rituals make adults. Grace managed trailhead outreach for the district now, a job that let her stand at the beginning of journeys with useful words and reflective vests. She had become fluent in the calm tone people borrow from steady mornings. On a shelf sat the button and the dime in a small glass jar labeled Keep. Daniel had more gray at his temples and the same easy geometry in his hands. He taught younger crews how to tie anchors and how to listen to land. He never told the full story in trainings. He spoke of angles and patience and the moment when you decide to become weight for someone else. The repaired S-curve held, rougher and wiser. A second rail ran inside the first, posts set deeper, gravel graded to bite. People still drove too fast sometimes because people do. Fewer cars left the road because math and memory had worked together. On a cool September afternoon, they met again at a community safety day without surprise or fanfare. Lucas adjusted a demo harness on a kid who would remember only the feeling of being safe. Emilia handed out foil blankets to children who called them superhero capes. Grace refilled coffee urns and laughed at the way time can be merciful. Daniel checked the clouds out of habit. They were polite and unambitious. He looked at the ridge and felt the old good tiredness of a day spent helping. Grace caught his eye across a folding table crowded with maps and muffins. They traded a nod that said exactly enough. As the sun leaned west, Grace walked the short path to the overlook. She set her hands on the rail, cool under her palms, and let memory stand beside her without knocking her knees. She whispered, not to the canyon but to the space 10 years could make. The car fell. We didn't. The sentence had become light as a feather, strong as steel. Watching from anywhere? Tell us your city and give this story a 0 to 10 rating. If it moved you, leave a comment and subscribe for more cinematic rescues. Image prompt, copy and paste photorealistic cinematic still, 16:9, 4K UHD high dynamic range, crisp natural daylight. A ruggedly handsome man in outdoor gear, no helmet, braced against a bent mountain guardrail, rescuing a terrified mother and her 2 young children from a blue hatchback teetering over a cliff. The man has one arm around the mother's shoulders as he guides her out through a narrow rear door, the other hand gripping a climbing rope/webbing harness that secures the younger child. The older child is already safe behind the guardrail wrapped in a silver thermal blanket. Rain-misted pine forest, wet asphalt, broken rail, canyon drop visible below. Tense, dramatic, hyper-detailed textures. Raindrops, mud splashes, car scratches. Shallow depth of field with cinematic bokeh. Sharp, clear lighting, no motion blur. Color graded like a contemporary disaster drama.